At 10:07 this morning, the United States Supreme Court delivered a 6-3 ruling that destroys the foundation of Donald Trump's trade policy. Chief Justice John Roberts announced the decision in Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump, striking down the president's authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval. The ruling invalidates $175 billion in tariff collections as unconstitutional overreach. But this was not just any Supreme Court loss. Two of Trump's own appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, voted to kill his tariff authority, joining with liberal justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson to declare that tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act are illegal. Within 3 hours, FedEx Corporation filed the first federal lawsuit demanding a full refund of $847 million in tariff payments. Legal experts at the Penn-Wharton budget model estimate the federal government now owes American companies more than $175 billion in illegal tariff collections. Subscribe to this channel immediately because what I am about to walk you through is not just Trump losing a Supreme Court case. This is his own judicial appointees rejecting the legal foundation of his presidency. This is the largest financial reversal in presidential history. And this is a party fracturing in real time as Trump attacks the justices he put on the court. Here is what actually happened in the 2 weeks leading to this constitutional earthquake, because the details reveal how Trump's own legal strategy created the conditions for his most devastating defeat, February 18, 2026. Final oral arguments in Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump revealed deep skepticism from conservative justices who had previously supported expansive executive power. Chief Justice Roberts opened questioning by asking Trump's Solicitor General whether any president could unilaterally impose tariffs using emergency powers legislation passed by Congress in 1977. Elizabeth Prelogar, representing the Biden administration's position supporting congressional authority, faced friendly questioning from justices who typically challenge liberal positions. But it was Amy Coney Barrett's exchange with Trump attorney James Burnham that signaled trouble for the administration. Barrett asked whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, designed for asset freezes during genuine emergencies, could justify permanent tariff policy lasting multiple years. Quote, Mr. Burnham, how does a 2-year tariff regime qualify as emergency action? Emergency suggests urgency and temporary measures, not permanent trade policy. Burnham responded that China's economic competition constituted a continuing emergency justifying sustained presidential action. Barrett followed up with the question that would define her vote, but if economic competition qualifies as emergency, what limits exist on presidential power? Could a president declare emergency over unemployment and set minimum wages? Could emergency powers justify price controls? Burnham argued those examples exceeded tariff authority. Barrett responded, I don't see the limiting principle. Either Congress granted broad emergency economic powers or it didn't. Your position suggests it did. Neil Gorsuch focused his questioning on textual interpretation of the 1977 statute. Speaking to both attorneys, he noted that IEEPA authorizes presidents to regulate transactions during emergencies, but never explicitly mentions tariffs as an authorized tool. Quote, Congress knows how to grant tariff authority. The Tariff Act of 1930 does so explicitly. If Congress intended IEEPA to authorize tariffs, why didn't it say so? The courtroom exchange that sealed the outcome came when Justice Clarence Thomas asked Prelogar whether the administration would accept any limits on IEEPA authority. Prelogar argued that emergency powers require both genuine emergency and clear congressional authorization. Thomas pressed, but every president since Carter has expanded IEEPA usage. Are you saying decades of precedent were wrong? Prelogar's answer revealed the liberal strategy Justice Thomas were saying that constitutional separation of powers requires clear congressional authorization for powers this significant. Tariff authority affects every American consumer and every international relationship. That's exactly what the founders wanted Congress to control. Thomas nodded but said nothing further. Court observers noticed he took no additional notes. Behind the scenes, according to two sources familiar with the deliberations, the conservative justices held private discussions about whether supporting Trump's position would create dangerous precedent for future Democratic presidents. One source described Barrett as genuinely troubled by the idea that any president could impose massive economic policies without congressional votes. The internal court dynamics shifted during Justice Brett Kavanaugh's questioning. Kavanaugh, who typically supports executive power, asked whether IEEPA emergency declarations could be time-limited to force congressional review. When Burnham argued that emergencies could be permanent, Kavanaugh visibly reacted with surprise. After oral arguments concluded, legal observers noted unusual behavior from typically Trump-friendly justices. Samuel Alito asked pointed questions about whether emergency tariffs could trigger World Trade Organization violations affecting American treaty obligations. Brett Kavanaugh inquired about the difference between emergency asset freezes and permanent trade policy. But the clearest signal came from Chief Justice Roberts, who asked both sides whether the court should defer to presidential emergency determinations or apply heightened scrutiny to claims of permanent emergency. When Burnham argued for complete deference, Roberts responded, "So the president declares emergency, Congress has no role, and courts cannot review. That's your position?" The 47-page majority opinion released this morning, written by Chief Justice Roberts, contains devastating analysis of presidential overreach that reads like a constitutional law treatise on separation of powers. Quote, "The International Emergency Economic Powers Act provides no clear authorization for unilateral tariff imposition. This represents a fundamental misreading of congressional intent and constitutional structure. Tariff policy affects every American household, every international relationship, and every sector of the domestic economy. The founders placed such authority in Congress for precisely this reason." Roberts continued, "Emergency powers exist to address genuine crises requiring immediate action when Congress cannot convene. Permanent trade policy implemented over multiple years represents the opposite situation: sustained economic governance that demands legislative deliberation and democratic accountability." The opinion's most damning section addresses Trump's legal theory directly. The executive argues that economic competition with China constitutes permanent emergency justifying indefinite presidential action. This theory would authorize any president to declare emergency over any economic condition affecting national interests. Under this interpretation, minimum wage, price controls, banking regulation, and industrial policy could all become emergency presidential powers. Constitutional separation of powers cannot survive such expansion of unilateral executive authority. Justice Barrett wrote a separate concurring opinion joined by Justice Gorsuch that focuses on textual interpretation. Quote, "Congress drafted IEP to authorize asset freezes, transaction prohibitions, and similar emergency financial measures. The statute's text mentions transactions 17 times and tariffs 0 times. If Congress intended to grant tariff authority, traditionally the most significant trade power, it would have said so explicitly." Barrett's concurrence includes language that directly criticizes Trump's legal approach. Constitutional governance requires that emergency powers remain emergency powers when emergency becomes tyranny. Justice Gorsuch's separate concurrence applies originalist constitutional interpretation to reach the same conclusion. Quote, "At the founding, tariff authority belonged exclusively to Congress under the Commerce Clause. The founders viewed unilateral executive trade policy as the epitome of tyrannical governance they had fought to reject. Emergency powers cannot transform unconstitutional action into constitutional authority." The 23-page dissent filed by Justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito represents the most forceful defense of presidential power issued by conservative justices during Trump's presidency. Thomas wrote, "The majority abandons decades of executive deference precedent during a time of economic warfare with China. Presidential authority to respond to foreign economic threats cannot depend on the legislative calendar or congressional political calculations." Thomas argues that China's trade practices constitute genuine emergency, justifying sustained presidential response. When foreign powers manipulate currency, steal intellectual property, and undermine American manufacturing through state subsidies, presidential action becomes necessary regardless of congressional appetite for confrontation. The dissent's sharpest language targets the majority's constitutional interpretation. Today's decision strips future presidents of tools necessary to defend American economic interests. The majority prioritizes theoretical separation of powers over practical governance in an era of economic competition that threatens national security. But even Thomas acknowledges constitutional limits in his dissent. "We do not suggest that presidential emergency powers are unlimited. However, economic threats from foreign powers clearly fall within presidential authority to defend national interests." Translation: even the dissenting conservatives admit that presidential power has limits. They just disagree about where those limits begin. Hit that like button right now if you understand the significance. This is not just Republicans losing a vote, they control the chamber. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to understand how constitutional governance actually works. Markets had prepared for potential adverse ruling, but the speed of corporate response exceeded expectations. At 12:47 p.m., 43 minutes after the decision was announced, currency traders began selling dollars against major trading partners affected by Trump's tariffs. The euro jumped 1.1% within 2 hours as European companies positioned for potential refund windfalls. By 1:30 p.m., Import-heavy retailers saw stock prices surge on expectations of tariff refunds. Walmart gained 3.2%, Target rose 4.1%, and Home Depot increased 2.8% as investors calculated windfall profits from potential refund payments. At 1:47 p.m., Donald Trump responded to the Supreme Court decision with characteristic fury. Posting on Truth Social, he wrote, "Gorsuch and Barrett are an embarrassment to their families. I gave them everything and they stabbed me in the back. The Supreme Court is a disgrace to our country. These justices have no idea what they've done to America." Trump continued his attack in a follow-up post. Neil Gorsuch and Amy Barrett are weak, pathetic justices who sided with China over America. They will go down in history as traitors to the conservative movement and to the country that made their careers possible. The attacks on his own appointees triggered immediate political consequences across Republican leadership. Within hours, Republican senators found themselves forced to choose between defending the Supreme Court or defending their party's president. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, typically a Trump ally, posted on X the court abandoned conservative principles to help corporate America avoid paying their fair share. President Trump's response is completely justified. These justices sold out working families to multinational corporations. But Senator Mitt Romney of Utah took the opposite position. The justices followed the Constitution and separated powers as the founders intended. The president should follow their ruling instead of attacking the institution he swore to defend. The most significant Republican response came from Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota, who issued a carefully worded statement attempting to avoid taking sides. The court's decision requires careful congressional review. We will examine whether legislative action is necessary to clarify executive emergency powers while respecting constitutional separation of powers. Translation: Thune is terrified of defending $175 billion in illegal government seizures during an election year, but equally terrified of criticizing Trump's Supreme Court appointees. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas defended Trump's position while criticizing the decision. This ruling hands China a victory they couldn't win through diplomacy or fair competition. When American presidents cannot respond to economic warfare, American workers lose. But Senator Susan Collins of Maine broke with Trump entirely. Attacking Supreme Court justices for following the Constitution undermines the rule of law that protects every American's rights. The president's response is inappropriate and dangerous. The corporate response exploded across multiple industries simultaneously. At 2:23 p.m., FedEx Corporation and FedEx Logistics filed federal lawsuits in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, seeking full refunds of all tariff payments made under Trump's IEEPA authority. The company's court filing claims $847 million in illegal tariff collections since Trump's emergency declaration. FedEx CEO Raj Subramaniam issued a statement that became the template for corporate response. Today's Supreme Court decision confirms what we have argued from the beginning: these tariffs were imposed without constitutional authority. We intend to pursue full recovery of all payments made under this illegal program. Within hours, General Motors announced it would pursue all legal remedies to recover unconstitutionally collected tariffs affecting our operations and our customers. The company estimates it paid $1.3 billion in tariffs on Chinese parts and materials since Trump's emergency declaration. The National Association of Manufacturers, representing 14,000 companies, called for immediate congressional action to authorize refund payments and prevent prolonged litigation that would harm both businesses and government fiscal stability. But the most significant corporate response came from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents America's largest corporations. Chamber President and CEO Suzanne Clark issued a statement that amounts to declaration of war against Trump's trade policy. This decision restores constitutional governance to American trade policy. For too long, unilateral presidential action has replaced the congressional deliberation and democratic accountability that major economic policy requires. International reaction revealed how global partners viewed Trump's tariff policy as fundamentally illegitimate. European Union Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis posted on social media, "This ruling vindicates our position that American tariffs violated both constitutional governance and World Trade Organization rules. We look forward to more rational American trade policy based on law rather than unilateral presidential declarations." The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a rare statement praising an American Supreme Court decision. "We hope this decision leads to more rational American trade policy that benefits both Chinese and American consumers and businesses." Translation: Beijing is thrilled that Trump's primary economic weapon has been declared illegal by his own judicial appointees. Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland announced that Canada would review whether to seek refunds for Canadian companies affected by these illegal tariffs and explore whether similar constitutional questions exist regarding other American trade actions. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum went further, announcing that Mexico would file formal complaints with both USMCA dispute resolution panels and World Trade Organization tribunals seeking damages for economic harm caused by illegal American protectionism. The market cascade accelerated throughout the afternoon as investors calculated the fiscal implications of $175 billion in refund liability. The dollar dropped 1.3% against major currencies within 4 hours of the decision as foreign exchange traders positioned for American fiscal stress. Treasury bond yields jumped 0.15% as bond investors demanded higher returns to compensate for increased government borrowing that refund payments would require. The 10-year Treasury yield reached 4.73%, the highest level since Trump's inauguration. Import-dependent sectors surged while Trump-protected industries collapsed. Steel stocks fell 6.8% as investors anticipated the return of Chinese competition. Aluminum companies dropped 5.2%. Solar panel manufacturers declined 4.3% on expectations that Chinese solar imports would resume at lower prices. Meanwhile, retailers, automakers, and consumer electronics companies saw massive gains. Tesla gained 7.1% on calculations that eliminating Chinese parts tariffs would reduce manufacturing costs by $1.2 billion annually. Apple rose 5.8% as investors anticipated cheaper Chinese component costs increasing profit margins. The political implications extended beyond immediate market reactions. House Democrats immediately announced hearings on presidential abuse of trade authority scheduled for next week. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries issued a statement demanding Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appear before Congress to account for $175 billion in illegal collections from American families and businesses. Jeffries continued, for 2 years, this administration has been collecting taxes that the Supreme Court now declares unconstitutional. Every American family that paid higher prices due to these illegal tariffs deserves immediate refunds and explanations. House Democrats also announced they would subpoena all Treasury Department communications regarding tariff collections and any internal legal opinions questioning the program's constitutionality. But the most devastating political response came from unexpected quarters. Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a libertarian Republican who typically supports Trump, posted on social media, "The Supreme Court correctly applied the Constitution. Congress controls tariffs. Presidents cannot impose taxes without legislative authority. This is basic separation of powers." Massie's position creates a constitutional crisis for Republican leadership. Defending Trump requires defending presidential tax collection without congressional approval, which violates core conservative principles about taxation and representation. Turn on notifications because the next 72 hours will determine whether this becomes a financial crisis, a political crisis, or a constitutional crisis. Here is what we are watching for over the next 7 days. Because 6 specific indicators will determine whether Trump's presidency survives this judicial rebuke or whether constitutional governance collapses entirely. Indicator 1, congressional response speed. If Republicans move quickly to pass emergency legislation retroactively authorizing Trump's tariffs and capping refund liability at $50 billion, Trump maintains some control over the narrative and the fiscal damage. If they delay, refuse, or split over defending $175 billion in illegal collections, his trade policy collapses entirely and his influence over Republican economic policy dies. Indicator 2, lawsuit avalanche magnitude. If more than 100 major companies file federal refund lawsuits within 72 hours, the refund liability could exceed $200 billion as legal discovery reveals additional illegal collections. If lawsuits remain limited to the largest importers, Treasury can manage the crisis through negotiated settlements rather than court judgments. Indicator 3, Trump versus Gorsuch and Barrett, escalation. If Trump continues attacking his appointees publicly through social media and rallies, he risks losing their support in other pending cases involving presidential power, immigration authority, and criminal proceedings. If he stops attacking them, he appears weak to his political base and admits defeat. Indicator 4, market stability and dollar strength. If the dollar continues falling and bond yields rise above 4.8%, the financial cost of refunds triggers broader economic instability affecting mortgage rates, credit markets, and government borrowing costs. If markets stabilize by Friday, refunds become manageable fiscal policy rather than economic emergency. Indicator 5, international trade retaliation. If European Union and China demand that their companies receive equal refund treatment through international arbitration, the $175 billion liability potentially doubles or triples through treaty obligations. If they limit responses to statements and symbolic actions, liability remains domestic rather than international. Indicator 6. Republican Unity Collapse Test. If Senate Republicans publicly split between defending Trump's attacks on the court and defending constitutional institutions, Trump's influence over the party fractures permanently on judicial and constitutional issues. If they unite behind Trump despite the constitutional implications, institutional conflict escalates between branches of government. Indicator 7. Treasury Payment Mechanism and Timeline. If Treasury announces a formal refund process within 10 business days, refunds become inevitable and immediate fiscal reality requiring congressional appropriations. If they announce they will fight every refund claim individually through federal court, refunds could take years, but constitutional crisis intensifies. Here are the 3 scenarios that determine America's immediate future. Scenario 1. Congressional rescue and managed retreat. Republicans pass emergency legislation within 2 weeks, retroactively authorizing Trump's tariffs for national security purposes while capping total refund liability at $50 billion through compromise payments. Trump declares victory over activist judges by claiming he forced Congress to act, but his presidential authority over trade policy is permanently constrained by congressional oversight requirements built into the rescue legislation. Democratic and international opposition focuses on the constitutional precedent of retroactive authorization, but immediate crisis is contained. This is damage control that saves Trump's political position while permanently constraining presidential trade authority. Scenario 2. Refund cascade and controlled collapse. Treasury is legally forced to pay the full $175 billion in refunds over 18 months as hundreds of companies win federal lawsuits and courts order immediate payments. Congressional Republicans refuse to vote for retroactive authorization, fearing electoral consequences of defending illegal taxation. Trump's trade policy becomes the most expensive presidential legal mistake in American history, but he survives politically by blaming deep state judges and globalist corporations for sabotaging American workers. International partners demand equal treatment for their companies, potentially doubling refund costs, but economic damage remains limited to fiscal policy rather than broader constitutional breakdown. This is controlled collapse that destroys Trump's trade legacy while preserving constitutional governance. Scenario 3. Constitutional warfare and institutional breakdown. Trump refuses to authorize Treasury refund payments, claims executive privilege over trade enforcement, and orders federal agencies to ignore Supreme Court rulings and federal court judgments. Gorsuch and Barrett join liberal justices in holding Trump in contempt of court for defying judicial authority. Constitutional confrontation between executive and judicial branches escalates as Democrats initiate impeachment proceedings for defying court orders, while Republicans split between defending Trump and defending rule of law. International allies begin treating American legal commitments as unreliable due to institutional instability. Financial markets collapse amid uncertainty about whether American government respects its own constitutional structure. This is institutional warfare that destroys both Trump's presidency and American constitutional governance. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction. I am tracking all 3 scenarios and the 7 indicators that determine which path America follows. What I know for certain right now, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariff authority in a 6-3 decision. 2 Trump appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, voted against his position. American companies are legally owed $175 billion in illegally collected tariffs. FedEx has already filed federal lawsuits seeking $847 million in refunds. Trump called his own Supreme Court appointees an embarrassment to their families and traitors to the conservative movement. Congressional Republicans are now forced to choose between defending $175 billion in illegal taxation and defending constitutional separation of powers. The next 7 days determine whether this becomes a financial crisis, a political crisis, or a constitutional crisis. International partners view this as vindication of their position that American tariffs violated both constitutional governance and international trade law. This is not over. This is a president at war with the Supreme Court he created. This is the separation of powers functioning exactly as the founders intended and as Trump never expected. And we are watching in real time as the most expensive judicial rebuke in American history unfolds across our financial system, our political system, and our constitutional framework. The question is no longer whether Trump's trade policy survives. The question is whether American constitutional governance survives Trump's response to its destruction.